To all who come to this happy podcast, welcome. Welcome to This Happy Place, a Disney podcast. I am Will, and I welcome you to this series where I will be reviewing all 63 Disney animated films in chronological order. We are on number 5, which means the next movie up is Bambi, which also marks the end of the Golden Age, the first era of Disney animation. Like a lot of Disney movies, Bambi came from a children's book. The one that inspired Bambi was called Bambi, A Life in the Woods by author, and forgive me if I mispronounce his name, Felix Salten. This book was published in English for the first time in 1928, and it was shortly after that when the screen rights to adapt this book into a movie were secured. You may be thinking that Walt was that person that secured the rights, but that would actually be incorrect. Well-known film director for the time, Sidney Franklin, bought the rights as he saw the potential of making Bambi live action and the movie being more focused on showing nature from differing points of view. As Franklin was developing this idea, he came to the realization that this movie needed to be animated. The kind of story he wanted to tell was just better suited for the animated medium. The first person that Franklin went to was, of course, Walt Disney, and this move by Franklin of approaching Walt Disney to make Bambi an animated film was almost prophetic. Franklin came to Walt in 1933, a full 4 years before Disney made Snow White. This move of bringing Bambi to Disney to make a full-length feature film can speak to the pure expertise of the animation medium that was coming out of Walt Disney Animation Studios at that time. It wasn't until April of 1937, almost a year before Snow White came out, that Walt bought the screenplay rights to Bambi from Franklin. Franklin signed a consulting contract to help with the story development of Bambi, and in fact, Sidney Franklin has his own special title card in the beginning credits of Bambi. Bambi was initially going to be the second film to come from Walt Disney Studios, but there are several reasons as to why Bambi eventually became the fifth movie to come from the studio. First was simply trying to get the story and the feel of the film. The story was reworked so many times, and one account was said that coming up with the story of Bambi was the most difficult story that Disney ever came up with. It was extremely challenging to Walt, and Walt was even quoted by saying, "We were trying to build a story before we ever knew what it was." Meaning, they were trying to build a story for the movie without ever really knowing where they wanted to go with it first. Another big reason as to why this movie was delayed to 1942 was the animation. They wanted to make Bambi the most realistic looking animated film of all time. The animation team took a trip to Maine to make sketches of nature, but more specifically the trees and leaves, carefully detailing every little crack in each tree and in each leaf. When they got back to the studio, they started taking the notes from their trip and painted scenes as detailed and as intricate as possible. It took some time, maybe longer than it should have, for the animators to realize that if they were expecting themselves to make every leaf and tree look lifelike, Bambi could very well never get made. But with all the work they had done to get to that point, they were completely lost. Enter in Tyrus Wong. Wong had experience dabbling in art and paint, but it was actually his wife that encouraged him to try and get a job at Disney. He got the job at Disney, but the main purpose of him getting that job was just to get steady work. Tyrus Wong submitted a concept art for Bambi, and it was like nothing any of the animators currently working on the film thought about in regards to how Bambi could look. Tyrus's piece of concept art were based on more impression and feeling rather than stressing or depicting every branch of every tree. Tyrus grew up in China until he was about 9 years old, and you can definitely see the Chinese influence in his pieces. When you think of Chinese artwork, you think of watercolor, broad strokes that put a focus on evoking an emotion out of you. To explain his pieces of art, Tyrus explained, quote, I tried to keep the very, very simple and create the atmosphere, the feeling of the forest. At the Walt Disney Family History Museum in San Francisco, I don't know if this is how they do it now, but when I was there nearly 10 years ago, they had a special Bambi exhibit. They team up with the Disney Archives to have a special changing exhibit, and when I was there, it was all about Bambi and Tyrus Wong's artwork. At that time, I couldn't care less about Bambi, so I didn't even bother going into that part of the exhibit to look at those pieces, and I wish I did because I have looked up pictures of those, and they're all absolutely beautiful. Animating nature was one thing, but animating the animals themselves was a completely another beast to tackle. They have animated deer before in Snow White, but those deer were in a story that was a fantasy story. Since Bambi could really take place in any time period, they wanted to stress a realistic version of the animals. To do this, they did a couple of interesting things. First, they brought over 2 deer from Maine to basically become pets at the Disney studio. They had sessions where animators would just sit around the deer and note how they would behave. The deer were at the studio long enough that they actually started growing up so the animators could have references to different times of a deer's life. They also watched footage of a documentary to see what deer were like in their natural habitat. Coincidentally, that documentary that they used was made by Sidney Franklin's brother. They also brought in toddlers to help animate the facial expressions of young Bambi. Much like the deer, animators would spend time with these children and study their eyes, their face, and any other thing that can help them give any sort of idea to give expression to an animated deer. But unfortunately, when Bambi came out for Disney, it was a lackluster performer. It premiered to the public in the same place Snow White did, but while Snow White had sold out showings for 5 weeks in a row, Bambi closed after just about 2 weeks. World War II also affected it because they couldn't get it overseas in the way they wanted it to. But to combat this in America, they actually tried to market Bambi towards adults, as some criticisms of the movie stated that Bambi was done in too realistic a manner, that it took away any fantasy and that made it a bore to children. To market it to adults, they advertised Bambi as a love story, with a quote on marketing material saying, "The greatest love story ever told." Now, if you have seen Bambi, you will be scratching your head like I was, because while you do see characters falling in love, or as the movie calls it, Twitter-pated, those moments only last seconds, and there is nothing in here that can justify that statement of the greatest love story ever told. Like the other Disney movies that were most impacted by the war, once the war was over, Bambi found new life, and especially in India of all places. Of course, the movie was dubbed into their native language, but the score was actually also completely redone. They stripped away the music from the original American version and re-recorded it in an Indian style of music. There are conflicting reports that I've seen that this version was ever fully released to the public, but there was a clip shown on Walt's TV show at one point. But regardless, Walt loved how it was adapted beyond the dubbing, but I couldn't find any other record of Walt wanting to push the idea with other animated films. Now, what did I think of Bambi? As I was watching Bambi, there was one overwhelming feeling that I had starting about 10 minutes in. That feeling was boredom. There isn't anything that sticks out like a sore thumb to make me feel that way, so it made me think a little harder as to why I felt so bored while watching Bambi. But it suddenly clicked for me the first time when Bambi's mom first took Bambi into the meadow. Bambi's mom warns Bambi that the meadow is a dangerous place and how Bambi needs to make sure he stays by her at all times. I scratched my head a little bit because I got a little confused. If you know this meadow is a dangerous place, why are you willingly bringing your kid to it? The best answer I could come up with was while it was dangerous, the meadow is a fun place. You see Bambi having fun with Thumper and a bunch of other forest critters just having a good time. And then the hunter comes in, shoots a quail, but Bambi and his mom make it back to safety. I bring this up because I feel like there was just a lack of narrative reasoning as to why they are going into the meadow in the first place. And this part of the meadow was only set up because when they go to the meadow for the second time during winter, later on in the movie, that is when Bambi's mom gets shot. And I feel like the lack of narrative overall is what made me feel bored during this movie. The movie really isn't about anything. There isn't any discernible plot. It is just about Bambi and his life in the woods. It follows the life cycle of the deer and the other life around him. Bambi grows up, loses his mom, and learns how to live on his own. Kind of similar to The Lion King, actually. In fact, in the early stages of developing The Lion King was pitched as almost a Bambi in Africa. If you take time to look at the similarities between the two movies, you will actually be surprised with how many themes and events are similar between the two. But as the movie dragged on, the lack of a cohesive narrative made it more apparent that there wasn't anything really worth paying attention to. The movie dragged on, and it felt much longer than it actually was. Despite only being about 10 minutes longer than Dumbo, when Dumbo didn't feel like it dragged on at all, Bambi felt like it was a good half hour longer. I was just craving for something to hold on to make me interested in what the heck was going on, and I couldn't really find that thing for me. The artistry for this movie is definitely my favorite part of it, and I think it's by far the best part of it. Disney's famous multiplane camera is used in a beautiful way to depict the depth of the forest, helping us truly understand the amount of life, both plant and animal, that lives within. This does help towards the end of the movie, when a fire starts and burns the whole forest down. But I'm glad the movie doesn't end with the forest burning down. It ends with the forest showing new life after it got burned down. All the different animals and plants are flourishing again. This is my favorite part of the movie because it really is a message that I feel a lot of us could use right now. That no matter how bad something can get or how bad something is, there's always a possibility for a better tomorrow. Since there wasn't any real narrative going on, the thing that made me keep watching were the very lovable characters. Starting off with Bambi. You have this character who is young and innocent, who doesn't know much about the world around him. His emotion and his joy is infectious, and you can't help yourself but to root for this little deer, especially when his mom dies. I don't think you could be wrong in calling that scene one of the most emotional scenes that Disney has created. I feel like when a lot of people think back at that scene, they have a memory of actually seeing Bambi's mom get shot, but what they did is actually way more effective. You don't actually see Bambi's mom get shot. Bambi's mom instructs Bambi to run back home, and as Bambi is running, you don't see any characters on the screen when you hear a gunshot. They did the same thing when they went to the meadow for the first time, but Bambi's mom was okay, so you almost feel like when this happened again, hearing the gunshot but nothing happened, that Bambi's mom was safe again. However, when Bambi got home and he was excited to celebrate making it safely back with his mom, he slowly realizes that he can't find his mom anywhere. It's that sense of complete loss and confusion that we know what happened while Bambi does not, that leaves a lot to our imagination that makes it that more emotional. Bambi's dad comes and gets Bambi, saying something along the lines of, "Your mom isn't coming back." And while it's not directly said, it is inferred that Bambi's dad took responsibility to raise Bambi. Now, I haven't seen Bambi 2, the direct-to-DVD sequel of this movie, but I believe that movie is about the space of time between when Bambi's dad comes and gets him until the next spring. I could be wrong about that, but I do know the core of that movie is Bambi trying to reunite with his dad. As I've been watching all of these Disney movies, I've been making a list of some of my favorite characters. So far, the characters on that list are the dwarves. Yes, all 7 of them, because I feel like you have to count them as one. Jiminy Cricket and Dumbo. Bambi introduced a new favorite character for me, Thumper. It's so charming and it's impossible not to smile any time Thumper speaks. I love it how they got an actual 6-year-old child to do the voice, and that only helped creating the authenticity to the character. One of my favorite Thumper moments was there is this scene where Thumper says one part of his line, then he waits, kind of acts confused, and then he continues on with his line. The reason it is like that is because the child who voiced Thumper actually forgot his lines in that moment, and they actually animated that into the movie. Thumper thumping his foot on the ground, making his signature move, helping Bambi walk across the ice, and his laugh at Bambi when Bambi mistakenly calls a flower a butterfly and a skunk a flower just is adorable, and you want to see more of this little Thumper. While Bambi is a great movie to look at, I do agree with one review at that time that said the experience with Bambi is much closer to looking at a piece of art in a museum rather than a movie. Your movie can look great, but if there isn't any narrative substance to go along with it, there isn't much you can do to make it an exciting movie. Story should come first, and I know they spent a lot of time talking about the story of Bambi during its production, but honestly, I feel kind of surprised this is what they landed on, as there isn't a story in the same way there is on Snow White, Pinocchio, and Dumbo. I'm sure kids could love Bambi, as they don't really care about stories when they first start watching movies. It's a fun movie to look at, and I bet they would fall in love with the characters, because who wouldn't? But out of the 5 movies we have watched, Snow White, Pinocchio, Fantasia, Dumbo, and now Bambi, I have to rate Bambi 5th. I just didn't get any real emotional connection out of it, and for me, being bored is one of the worst things you can be while watching a movie. There are movies out there that are slow burns and are still interesting, but Bambi is just slow, and apart from the sweet message at the end about recovering from something that is devastating, there isn't any satisfying payoff to it. Thank you for listening to This Happy Place, a Disney podcast. And remember, there is a great, big, beautiful tomorrow shining at the end of every day.